This is BBC News, the headlines. A United Nations-backed report confirms there is now famine in Gaza City. Israel says it is based on Hamas propaganda. FBI agents have searched the home of Donald Trump's former national security advisor, John Bolton, who served in the president's first administration before becoming one of his most outspoken critics. And a crowd of more than 40,000 fans are expected tonight when the Women's Rugby Union World Cup kicks off in Sunderland. The hosts, England, face the United States. We've been discussing the situation around the Ukraine-Russia negotiations. We heard from Katie Watson before we went to the break. Let's bring in John Foreman. He's a former British defence attaché for Moscow and Kyiv. We've been seeing in the last hour these comments from Sergei Lavrov, who seems to be pouring cold water on the idea that there would be an imminent meeting between President Zelensky and President Putin. What do you make of it?
I've never thought there was a chance of Putin meeting Zelensky in the immediate future. I remember similar comments when Trump instigated talks between Russia and Ukraine in Istanbul, and people then said, Putin will go along and Zelensky's ready. There's no chance on earth that Putin's going to go there. Lavrov's talking about pre-meetings or pre-meetings or meetings about meetings. I think we're a long way off before a presidential meeting.
Kaja Kallas, the EU's top diplomat, has given an interview to the BBC today. She says there was a very positive spin put on everything last week, but now when we look at the detail, as you suggest, not much seems to add up, and she's calling it out in fairly unambiguous terms.
Well, I agree with her. I think we're on Groundhog Day. 2 weeks ago, Ukraine was being attacked. Trump was threatening sanctions against Russia. Europe was anxious. And Russia wasn't changing position, and nothing's really moved. We seem to be at Groundhog Day. We had a lot of light last week for the meetings and summits in Alaska and in Washington, D.C., but no heat. And actually, if you look at what's actually changed, Mark Rutte was talking about deadlocks being broken. I don't think the deadlock is still there. There are no peace talks. There is no ceasefire. There are no agreements on security guarantees, and Russia's not changing position.
Interestingly, President Trump put out a message on Truth Social last night, which seems to reflect some of his irritation. He says it's very hard, if not impossible, to win a war without attacking an invader's country. It's like a great team in sports that has a fantastic defence, he says, but is not allowed to play offence. He lays the blame for that at Joe Biden's door. But it tends to suggest, does it not, that he's interested in supplying more offensive weapons to Ukraine?
Yeah, America is already supplying offensive weapons to Ukraine, and Biden did that, and Trump continued that through the previous appropriation request. But I think Trump's got form for doing this sort of thing, throw things out there. He said, this time I'm really serious. If they don't do anything, the Russians, there'll be severe consequences. I'm really irritated with him. I'm disgusted about the attacks, he said, on Ukrainian cities. And then on the other hand, he said, well, 2 weeks' time, I have to decide another 2 weeks. And we sort of drift along in this sort of never-ending postponement. Trump has been very reluctant to bring down American power, or economic power or military power on Russia. And I don't think that's changing. And I think his meeting in Alaska was a signal of that. I think he came away looking weak, and Russia got out of it Putin got out of it what he wanted, and ultimately nothing much changed.
And when you look at it from a Russian perspective, obviously there's no threat of sanctions because the punishing energy sanctions that Trump had talked about in recent weeks, they've been taken off the table. And I wonder if the shape of the front line is also influencing where the Kremlin is coming from.
Yeah, so I think the Kremlin thinks it's got the initiative, it's got the advantage and the momentum, and it doesn't see that it needs to shift position. It thinks it's suffering obviously severe economic consequences, huge casualties, societal damage, and isolation in the world from many parts of the world. But that, I think Putin regards those as costs worth paying for the potential benefit of destroying Ukrainian sovereignty and bringing Ukraine back into the Russian orbit. And that's his overriding priority. And until such time as Trump is prepared to use sticks against Russia rather than just carrots, enticing them to better relationship, I don't think that's going to change. And we know that the American tariffs on India are going to be on the 27th of this month. Trump has form of sort of getting to that brink and then moving forward and shifting them right. And that's what he did in Russia just before, in the wake of Steve Witkoff visiting Moscow. So we get to these deadlines, these big moments, at which this will drift away, and we go down another 2 or 3 weeks down the road.
The NATO Secretary General is currently in Kyiv talking to President Zelensky about these security guarantees. But as Kaya Kallas said in this BBC interview, there's still pretty vague detail on the shape of the force, on the terms of engagement, how they would respond to Russian aggression. Do you think a coalition of the willing, do you think that is a runner?
Well, I was involved in the coalition of willing planning tangentially back in March. And I think there's a lot of military planning that's been going on, but actually offering security guarantees to another country is a political decision, not a military decision. Now, it strikes me that the mood music is much more now about strengthening Ukraine and the Ukrainian army and perhaps having a token presence force there as a Tretoir force. But it has to be credible. And it strikes me that the force proposed so far, even with American backup, won't be that big. It certainly wouldn't deter Russia. But the question really is, what happens if that deterrence fails? Then what? Are European countries prepared to punish Russia by force for invading Ukraine again? I don't think so. I think that what makes security guarantee discussion slightly more abstract is that at no stage have Europe or Americans been prepared to confront Russia militarily because of the risk of escalation of a war between Russia and NATO, and I don't think that's changed.
There are really two issues with that you point out. One is that if you are going to send a coalition force, then you have to be prepared to stand and fight. And the second issue is that the Russians have said from the outset they're not prepared to accept NATO nearer to their borders, and many of these troops would be drawn from NATO countries.
Yeah, I mean, on the second point, Lavrov's brought that out again. Now, I personally don't think that we have to ask permission from the Russians, the aggressor, for offering support and deterrence and reassurance to the Ukrainian people. We had that problem back in 1994 under the Budapest Memorandum, when people offered assurances, UK and US stood by their assurances and Russia didn't. But I think on the first point, I don't think anybody should be under the impression that the coalition of willing would be there to fight, because I don't think it's going to be big enough. And also because of the balance of forces, unless we're prepared to put 200,000 people into Ukraine, which I don't think anybody's prepared to. And I don't think the Americans are prepared to back that up with substantial forces, one of the American Deputy Secretaries of Defense said this week.
John Foreman, very grateful for your thoughts. Thank you very much. Here, the government has taken a first step in appealing a High Court decision that asylum seekers cannot be housed at a hotel in Essex. The Home Office is seeking permission to intervene in the case, which, if granted, would allow it to appeal the interim judgment that was handed down last week. Epping Forest District Council won an interim injunction to stop migrants from being accommodated at the Bell Hotel in Epping. The hotel's owner has in the last hour said it will also appeal the order. There are protests expected at other hotels across the country this weekend, and there are other councils, some of them Labour councils, that are considering similar legal challenges. Let's bring in then our news correspondent Tom Simons, who is here and watching developments. The Home Office had warned that this decision at the High Court could substantially impact their ability to house asylum seekers. So it's not entirely surprising that they're challenging it.
And it definitely will, because of all these other councils that are saying, look, if it worked for Epping, if it worked for Epping Forest, the council, they're a Conservative-held council trying to remove this asylum hotel effectively from the edge of its town, then it could work for us too. And that gives the Home Office a massive headache, because it doesn't have lots of places to put asylum seekers. It has opened new hotels recently. The one in Canary Wharf, Britannia Hotel, has only just been started to be filled up with asylum seekers, so there's some space there. But if it has to find new places for lots of these asylum seekers, then that will be a major headache, which is why we're seeing this appeal today. And it's effectively the government asking the court to let it have a say. The previous judge at the lower court, the High Court, saying, we're not going to decide to let you have a say in this case. And also the hotel company is also asking for an appeal as well. So if that is granted, then the next step, potentially, that the High Court, the Court of Appeal could hear something on this.
For those viewers around the world who may not have been following this closely, how many hotels are currently being used here in the UK, and what does the population within those hotels look like?
Well, so we're talking about hotels, often ones that are particularly commercially viable. I mean, some of them probably are, but they're not the sort of big tourist hotels in the middle of big tourist cities. They're generally in out-of-the-way places, smaller towns, and the owners of those held hotels have decided to sign a contract with the Home Office, the Interior Ministry of the UK, effectively to let asylum seekers live there. They get paid for, the food and lodging is paid for by the government. And some of them have now become fortresses because of the controversial nature of this policy. The Bell Hotel in Epping, which is the one that sparked this court case, is surrounded by railings. I've been there when there have been protests, and you can hear the tannoy going off inside the hotel telling the asylum seekers to stay in their rooms for their own safety. So this is a serious business. There are about 200 currently being used at the moment, but the government would swiftly point out that it has reduced that number from 400 at the height of the use of hotels. And the reason the government needs them is that it has a massive backlog of asylum seeker claims it is trying to clear. So these are people who are waiting to hear if they get the right to stay in the UK.
Yeah, the new immigration stats yesterday suggest the number of asylum seekers in these hotels has gone up 8% in the last year, albeit that it's come down slightly since March. And Labour says, yeah, we're trying. It's not easy, though, is it, if the number of small boat crossings is increasing? And so the question becomes, is this the solution, and is there an alternative method of housing asylum seekers that they might be looking at?
Well, so the government thinks it is the solution, closing the hotels, because it's made a commitment to do so by the next election, which could be sort of 2029 potentially. So it is not accepting the use of hotels, it's saying we want to close them. But the alternatives are much smaller properties, just normal houses, perhaps turned into multiple occupancy houses, bought up by the government or by the providers, three companies who provide this accommodation. And then the other alternative, of course, is former military bases. We've seen Wethersfield, a big former military base, being used to house asylum seekers. The government says that's actually more expensive than using hotels, which are just there and could be used. And also they tend to be controversial in their own right, because obviously a large number of asylum seekers being held in often out-of-the-way rural places, that can be something that local people respond against too. So really, for the government, the only answer here is to reduce the numbers coming in and speed up the processing of the claims that they have got to deal with when people do come in. But both of those are possibly some of the biggest headaches this government faces.
Tom Simons, thank you very much indeed. And as I mentioned, more protests expected this weekend, so certainly a story that's not going to go away. Let's talk about steel in the UK. The largest steel works has collapsed and is now under government control, which puts at risk nearly 1,500 workers in Rotherham and Sheffield. Yesterday, a court issued a compulsory winding up order against Speciality Steels UK. It's part of Liberty Steel. Our reporter Eunice Muller reports from Stocksbridge in South Yorkshire.
Speciality Steels UK produces high-quality steel that we need for defence and aerospace, but the plants in South Yorkshire have effectively been mothballed for a year, with creditors owed more than £200 million. Hopelessly insolvent is how a judge described the business, which is now under government control until a buyer can be found. Chris Williamson from the Community Union has worked for the steelworks for almost 3 decades.
Well, I'm hopeful, but obviously it's all the uncertainty. We need to get some answers. I know it's going to take time. We've gone far too long without producing any steel, and we need investment and belief, and then it will be a new dawn for South Yorkshire.
Steel tycoon Sanjeev Gupta wanted more time to pull off a last-ditch deal, but when the judge was told the government would sustain the plant and continue to cover wages and other costs, he called time on Mr. Gupta's ownership. 15 Gupta-owned companies are facing insolvency proceedings around the world. His empire rocked ever since his main backer, Greensill Capital, went bust over 4 years ago. The company has been placed in the hands of the official receiver, that's a government-appointed liquidator, and special managers from a consultancy firm have already arrived on site to start work. High energy costs, stiff international competition and lingering tariff uncertainty have placed massive strains on this industry. But there is demand for the type of steel produced here.
My understanding is there are a number of companies who are interested in the sites. Now look, of course you'll get some that are better and some that are less good, and it's got to have the bright future it deserves. We can't be back in this situation in 5 or 10 years' time, but if we get the right owner with the right model and the right investment, there's no reason why the workers can't be back at work and these sites can't be back up and running.
For the government, steel remains of national importance. Taxpayers will now bear the cost and risks of a loss-making steel plant. Eunice Muller, BBC News, Stocksbridge.
We're going to take a short break. Around the world and across the UK, you're watching BBC News. The former Sri Lankan president, Ranil Wickremesinghe, has been arrested in an investigation into his alleged misuse of government funds during his overseas trips. The former president was taken into custody on Friday in connection with his visit to Britain in 2023 when he was still the head of state. It's alleged the former leader and his wife stopped off for a private visit on the way home and used state funds for something that was not official business. He has denied any wrongdoing. He claims he held several official meetings during that stopover. With me in the studio is Kethiki Meselamani. I know that you've been following it closely today, but actually the proceedings that he was sitting in didn't go according to plan.
Slight hiccup interrupted by a power cut. So his bail hearing has been adjourned for the day. It's been delayed and we should have some update later in the afternoon.
Which slightly speaks to the wider issue here, because Sri Lanka has been in the grip of a severe economic crisis, rampant inflation, acute food shortages, and he came in as president, negotiated with the IMF to try and get them out of the mire. So what is he accused of doing?
Ironically, he's accused of using state funds on a visit. The official wording is that he disguised his stopover in London as part of an official visit to Cuba and the US. What we know is that his wife was receiving an honorary doctorate at the University of Wolverhampton, and he stopped over here. And the official documents, the court documents, show that his delegation, his entourage, if you will, their airfares, their accommodation, it all added up to around US $50 million. He insists that his wife paid her own way. But obviously, that's quite a lot of money for a country that's still navigating an economic crisis.
And there was such huge frustration within Sri Lanka that while people were scrimping and saving just to put food on the table, there were Sri Lankan officials, high government ranking officers who were driving around in posh cars. And this is a very good example of that.
Absolutely. And he is touted before this allegation as trying to get the country back on that economic path to recovery. His predecessors were actually, there was a public outcry. We saw, all the vision coming through was of these mass protests because his predecessors were accused of the same crime, of misusing public funds to line their own pockets. And that's when he became a president for 2 years. Before, he'd been prime minister 6 times, but it was a case of always a bridesmaid, never a bride, until this moment. He's an incredibly erudite man, incredibly intelligent, a former lawyer by trade, and he was put in charge of getting the country back on track. So to see these allegations come through, it really is a sense of irony.
Erudite, but they kicked him out in a landslide defeat for him. How do you think he's viewed today in Sri Lanka?
I think it's a bit Marmite, if you will. Some people do credit him for getting the country back on these rails, the economic rails, but equally he's accused of not really holding his predecessors to, they were accused of the same crime and he didn't really do anything.
But that's the interesting thing here. Here you have a guy accused of something that he claimed he was fixing, and yet there are others that were linked to the Rajapaksa regime who were suspected of corruption, and they're still free and out.
Absolutely. What I can say is, in this latest elections in 2024, the person who was elected, Anura Dissanayake, his campaign was transparency. It was the anti-Rajapaksa, anti-Vikramasinghe messaging that he would be open and honest and that he would hold those in power to account, including himself. And that's what led to his landslide victory. And now we're sort of seeing his predecessors held to account as he promised. So could we see more?
Kath, we'll continue to watch that as we continue to watch images from Washington and particularly from Maryland. I can show you actually the pictures from outside John Bolton's home. These are live pictures. You'll see that FBI vehicles are outside the home where they arrived earlier this morning with a court order searching, we're told, for classified information. I can also show you a fairly nondescript image of his office. All you see there is a green door, but I have seen images which are on the live page on the BBC website of FBI officials going into his office as well, which is in Washington DC. He still keeps an office there, also searching for materials. We've been discussing earlier in the programme the acrimony, if you will, between John Bolton and the former president. No love lost since he left the administration, in the first administration, and he's been one of the president's fiercest critics. But I guess the concern will be that the president, the executive, is directing the FBI, directing the Attorney General to hunt down and to prosecute critics of the president. And although he's commented this morning saying he doesn't know anything about it, he's been pretty vocal in the past in his condemnation of John Bolton and his thoughts that they should be investigated. Previous investigations into whether or not he'd used classified information for his memoirs didn't turn up very much, but Kash Patel, the FBI director, having another go at it. Continue to watch that story. Let's focus on some lighter issues, because tonight the England women's rugby team will kick off their World Cup campaign. They're taking on the United States. It's a sellout in Sunderland. More than 40,000 fans will pack out the Stadium of Light for the tournament's opener, but will the Red Roses rise to the occasion? The odds are pretty good, actually. England have lost just one of their past 58 matches, which puts them up there among the favourites. Let's bring in Tanya Arnold in our sports centre. It's already a successful home tournament in terms of ticket sales, but what are England's chances, do you think, on the pitch?
Well, they should, as you said, be very, very good. That one game that they lost was the World Cup final the last time around to New Zealand. They come into this as the #1 seeds, unbeaten in 27, and they have beaten all of those teams around them who will be their closest rivals for this. But you talk about those ticket sales, let's roll forward to the 27th of September and the World Cup final. If they get to that, Twickenham is a sellout. 82,000 fans will be there. Imagine the pressure that is on these women's shoulders. And then look at what the Lionesses have done for football, winning on home soil in the Euros back in 2022, elevated the sport massively. And there is no doubt that these women will be aware of that. So they have many rivals ahead of them, but they should fare very well on the pitch, and they should get it off to a winning start against the USA.
I mean, as you suggest, Tanya, I hate to compare the two sports, but obviously they will be trying to replicate the success that the Lionesses have had.
Absolutely. And, you know, the Lionesses, what they've done on the pitch has been magnificent. Back-to-back Euros campaigns, one of those, of course, at home. And it's what it's done for their sport, what it has elevated football in terms of participation, in terms of TV deals, in terms of sponsorship, and the voice that it has given women outside of sport as well, the profile that they have given. So, you know, they will desperately want to do that for their own sport, these women. But more importantly, they will want to lift that trophy.
And as some of us tune in to the tournament for the first time, I'm certainly one among them, who else should we be looking out for?
Well, the number 2 seeds are Canada, and they come in full of confidence. The only team that's beaten them in the last couple of years is the Red Roses, and they ran them very, very close indeed. They set up a mission statement, fundraising mission back in March, and the mission was win Rugby World Cup. So they come in very, very confident, and a lot of their players play over in this country as well, so they'll feel like they're on home turf too. And then there is New Zealand. We cannot overlook New Zealand. They were the ones that beat England in the World Cup final last time around, and they know how to win the World Cup. They have been in 6 finals and they have won 6 finals. So don't be fooled by the fact that they come in as the number 3 seeds.
They
know their way to lifting that World Cup trophy.
Right, we'll look out for them. Tanya, thank you very much for that. Stadium of Light, certainly a good place to kick off. Electric atmosphere up there tonight in Sunderland. We're going to take a short break. The headlines, of course, coming up. We are continuing to focus on that IPC report on the famine in Gaza and these pictures in Maryland, where the FBI are searching the home of Donald Trump's former National Security Advisor, John Bolton. All attempts to reach him so far have failed. So if he's listening and watching, come on and tell us about it and tell us what you know about this court order that's been issued. You're watching BBC News. Live from London, this is BBC News. Famine confirmed in Gaza City for the first time by a UN-backed body monitoring global hunger.
It is a famine openly promoted by some Israeli leaders as a weapon of war.
The FBI raids the home and office of Donald Trump's former national security advisor, John Bolton, now one of the president's fiercest critics.
I don't know about it. I saw it on television this morning. I'm not a fan of John Bolton. He's a real sort of a lowlife.
This is the scene live outside Bolton's house in Maryland. FBI officials have been seen carrying boxes into the property. Russia's foreign minister says there is no current plan for Vladimir Putin to meet Ukraine's President Zelensky.
Putin is ready to meet with Zelensky. When the agenda would be ready, this agenda is not ready at all.
And the Women's Rugby World Cup begins tonight with hosts England taking on the USA. Hello, I'm Christian Fraser. Welcome to Verified Live. After 22 months of relentless conflict in Gaza, a UN-backed body responsible for monitoring food security in the Palestinian territories has confirmed for the first time that famine is present in Gaza City and that deaths from starvation will rise exponentially. The IPC says more than 500,000 people in Gaza are facing starvation, destitution and death. Malnutrition, says the report, threatens the lives of 132,000 children under the age of 5. It is famine, said the IPC, that is entirely man-made and it can be halted and reversed. The areas in red on this map are those most severely affected and they include Gaza City. The report says that catastrophic conditions are projected to expand into Deir al-Balah and Khan Yunis by the end of September, but they have been unable to fully assess the situation in 2 other areas of the Strip. In response, Israel said the report was false and biased, based, they said, on Hamas lies. And again, the Israeli Foreign Ministry rejected any suggestion today that there was a famine in Gaza. Nonetheless, the United Nations Emergency Relief Coordinator, Tom Fletcher, reacted this way to the report. Speaking in Geneva, he said the famine must spur the world to more urgent action.
Good morning, everyone. Please read the IPC report, cover to cover. Read it in sorrow and in anger. Not as words and numbers, but as names and lives. Be in no doubt that this is irrefutable testimony. It is a famine, the Gaza famine. It is a famine that we could have prevented if we had been allowed. Yet food stacks up at borders because of systematic obstruction by Israel. It is a famine within a few hundred meters of food in a fertile land. It is a famine that hits the most vulnerable first, each with a name, each with a story, that strips people of dignity before it strips them of life, that forces a parent to choose which child to feed, that forces people to risk their lives to seek food. It is a famine that we repeatedly warned of, but that the international media has not been allowed in to cover, to bear witness. It is a famine in 2025, a 21st century famine, watched over by drones and the most advanced military technology in history. It is a famine openly promoted by some Israeli leaders as a weapon of war. It is a famine on all of our watch. Everyone owns this. The Gaza famine is the world's famine. It is a famine that asks, but what did you do? A famine that will and must haunt us all. It is a predictable and a preventable famine. A famine caused by cruelty, justified by revenge, enabled by indifference, and sustained by complicity. It is a famine that must spur the world to more urgent action, that must shame the world to do better. It is a famine that therefore also asks, and what now will you do? My ask, my plea, my demand to Prime Minister Netanyahu and anyone who can reach him: enough. Ceasefire. Open the crossings, north and south, all of them. Let us get food and other supplies in, unimpeded, and at the massive scale required. End the retribution. It is too late for far too many, but not for everyone in Gaza. Enough. For humanity's sake, let us in.
Tom Fletcher from the UN speaking a short time ago. Well, let's take a look inside that report and examine how the IPC defines famine. It says there are 5 phases. The highest level is phase 5, catastrophe. That means that at least 1 in 5 households would face an extreme food shortage. At least 30% of children suffering from acute malnutrition, and at least 2 in every 10,000 people dying each day due to outright starvation or disease brought on by malnutrition. Let's speak to Shazia Arshad. She is Head of Communications at Islamic Relief UK. Now, you're a charity that supports newborn babies and mothers through a maternal health programme in Gaza. We're told that 135,000 in this report are at risk of starvation. How much food aid, how much nutrition do you have locked outside the gates of Gaza City?
Moment, we are desperately needing to get our food aid into Gaza. We have trucks that are waiting. They have been there for some time now to get into Gaza. And immediately what we are calling for is for food aid to be scaled up and to be allowed to get into Gaza at pace. Today's declaration is confirmation of what we've been warning of and what other INGOs and UN agencies have been warning of for months, that famine is likely to take place. And we're concerned, extremely concerned, that those warnings haven't been heeded and that we're now having to live through this reality of it coming to fruition.
But you have to deal now in getting that aid to the people that need it with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which in light of this report is a bit of an oxymoron. What obstacles do they put in your place?
Current system is not working. I think that is really been clearly marked over the last few months. What we've seen is that people who are trying to access aid through the system and through the Gaza Humanitarian Forum, essentially what's happening is aid is just not getting through at the pace that it's needed, and it's not safe for people to get aid. Our own colleague lost members of their family not long ago, a few weeks ago, when they were trying to access food aid. That reality hits really close to home, but it's the reality for many people who are trying to access aid, but they're simply not able to because the current system is not accessible, it is not safe, and it is not getting food in at the pace that is needed.
And it is always the most vulnerable in those circumstances that will suffer, particularly children. How does it manifest itself? What are your staff that are inside Gaza telling you about what they're seeing?
The situation is absolutely terrifying, and when we think about the impact that it's having on children, particularly, it is really concerning. We know that about over 130,000 children under the age of 5 are going to be suffering from acute malnutrition, and the impact of that on a young child at crucial development stages of their life is very, very significant. And we're talking about long-term health impacts that are going to be facing those children. What we have to realise is that this is a man-made famine. This could have been preventable if food had been allowed into Gaza, if aid supplies had been allowed into Gaza at the pace required and as quickly as possible. That hasn't happened. Enough international pressure has not been applied on Israel to end the blockade and to get food in and to get aid in. And what's been allowed to happen is starvation has been allowed to be used as a weapon of war, and that's inflicted some of the worst consequences on some of the most vulnerable people.
Our correspondent Rushdie Abulouf was telling us in the last hour that a kilo of tomatoes currently in Gaza City costs around 120 shekels. That's over $30. There are very few people in Gaza that can afford that. And indeed, there are people he's spoken to whose children, 3-year-old children, have not eaten ever in their life vegetables or fruit. How do you think that will deteriorate if and when this operation in Gaza City unfolds?
The current situation means that because food supplies are the very, very limited food supplies that are able to be available to purchase on the commercial market are so expensive, very few families can afford to feed their families. Very few families can afford to buy those goods. What that means is that they are reliant on the very small amounts of aid that they're able to access. And in reality, that means that very few people are actually able to access food. Now, if you're going days and weeks without access to decent meals, to decent food, that has a significant impact, not just on your physical health, also on your mental health. And we have to realise that those impacts are as a result of this situation of food not being allowed in.
But if you we're looking at pictures of places like Al-Mawasi where supposedly there is a safe zone for people to go. But if you put another 1 million people into these areas, surely you compound the problem.
There's no such place as a safe space in Gaza. Everywhere across Gaza has been subjected to bombardment. Everywhere across Gaza has been subjected to complete devastation. It doesn't matter where people are at the moment because there is no safety that's guaranteed. Alongside that, whilst we have this situation of a famine being confirmed in Gaza City today, we know that by the end of September, it is very likely that the famine will have spread across to Deir al-Balah and Khan Yunis. Now, at that rate, if famine is continued to allow to spread, it will spread across the rest of the Gaza Strip. That means more and more families will be impacted by it. So not only are families then having to deal with the consequences of famine, with the lack of access to food and creeping food insecurity, they're also having to continue to live under conflict, continue having to live under consistent bombardment. Alongside that, they're often being displaced multiple occasions. Our own teams on the ground have been displaced on multiple occasions. So they have nowhere safe to live, nowhere safe to keep their families, and no sign that any of the situation is going to end anytime soon, and no access to food.
Shazia Ashad from Islamic Relief, thank you very much for being with us. Well, as I mentioned at the top, the Israeli government has firmly rejected today's findings in the IPC report. The military body that coordinates aid, that is KOGAT, issued its own response. KOGAT, they said, categorically rejects the Gaza report, including the claim of famine in the Gaza Strip and particularly in Gaza City. Previous reports and assessments by the IPC, they add, have repeatedly been proven inaccurate and do not reflect the reality on the ground. They call the IPC's evaluation one-sided, an assessment which disregards, they say, the extensive humanitarian efforts undertaken in Gaza. Plenty more on that story on the BBC website. We will take a short break. You're watching BBC News. The FBI have raided the Maryland home of Donald Trump's former national security advisor, John Bolton, who was stripped earlier this year of his national security clearance. Just before 7 o'clock this morning, the feds, accompanied by the Montgomery County Police and the New York Post photographers, sealed off the street leading to Bolton's residence. Armed with a court order, they went into his home in search of classified records. Bolton served 2 Republican presidents, first George W. Bush as ambassador to the United Nations and later as national security advisor to President Trump in his first administration. But they did not part on good terms. His memoir was fiercely critical of the president, and in response, Trump accused him of leaking classified material in the story he'd told. In one of his first decisions in office in January, he removed Bolton's security detail, despite credible reports that Iran had threatened to kill him. Shortly after news of the raids broke, the FBI Director Kash Patel posted on X, "No one is above the law. FBI agents on mission." The Attorney General, Pam Bondi, also appeared to refer to the raid in a message she posted. "America's safety isn't negotiable. Justice will be pursued. Always." In the last hour or so, FBI agents were seen carrying large cardboard boxes up to the property and handing them over to gloved officials inside the house. Officials have also been at Mr. Bolton's office in DC. We're all over the map on this story. This is the scene live outside John Bolton's house in the Washington, DC suburb of Bethesda, Maryland. This was what Donald Trump had to say in just the last hour.
Mr. President, have you been briefed on the FBI raid of John Bolton's home?
No, I don't know about it. I saw it on television this morning. I'm not a fan of John Bolton. He's a real sort of a lowlife. When I hired him, he served a good purpose because, as you know, he was one of the people that forced Bush to do the ridiculous bombings in the Middle East. Bolton, he wants to always kill people. And he's very bad at what he does, but he worked out great for me because every time he doesn't talk, he's like a very quiet person, except on television. If he could say something bad about Trump, he'll always do that. But he really doesn't talk, he's quiet. And I'd walk into a room with him with a foreign country, and the foreign country would give me everything because they said, "Oh no, they're going to get blown up because John Bolton is there." He's not a smart guy, but he could be a very unpatriotic guy. I mean, we're going to find out. I know nothing about it. I just saw it this morning. They did a raid.
Do you expect the DOJ to brief you on this?
Yeah, they'll brief me probably today sometime.
And the Foreign Minister.
I tell Pam and I tell the group. I don't want to know, but just you have to do what you have to do.
If you were struggling to read what was written on his hat, it says Trump was right about everything. Certainly he was right about the investigations there would be into his detractors. This is the picture live outside his John Bolton's office this hour. We know that the FBI detectives are also in that building as well. Let's show you again the picture outside his home. You'll be able to see the front door at his home in Bethesda. And our State Department correspondent Tom Bateman is there, who was there remarkably quickly, but not as quick as the New York Post, Tom, who seemed to be inside the cordon as the feds were going in.
Yeah, it was interesting that the New York Post had that story very early before everyone else, and when confirmation was being sought about whether this was indeed an FBI raid of John Bolton's home, some of the guidance was steering people towards that New York Post story from officials. So it feels like perhaps there was a bit more information before the raid to parts of the US media, and therefore sort of highlighting the fact that this had taken place. And of course, then we all showed up. What we have seen, Christian, in the last 20 minutes or so, you mentioned those FBI agents who were taking what appeared to be empty cardboard boxes into the house. We had a bit more activity in the last 20 minutes or so with the cars being moved around in the driveway here by the FBI, and then 3 officials in FBI jackets who made their way across the road to the police squad cars here and then back over to the house. So they still seem to be inside there. In terms of what the FBI said officially on the record, they're just saying this is part of court-authorized activity. We know from anonymous officials who have said that this is part of an investigation in their work